Charleston, South Carolina. June 3, 1847.
The morning began like any other in the grand dining room of Charleston's most powerful household. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, brushing across velvet curtains and glinting against silverware polished to a mirror's shine. The air carried the sweet aroma of mint tea, laced with sugar, poured steaming into delicate porcelain cups imported from England. The master sat at the head of the table, his posture stiff, his gaze commanding. He lifted his cup, steam curling around his face like a crown. He sipped, then he paused, a cough, sharp, violent, uncontrollable. His hand trembled, tea sloshing against the rim. His cheeks flushed crimson, then deepened into a dangerous purple. He grasped at his throat, gasping for air. A scream tore through the room as his wife dropped her fork, her own hand flying to her neck. The children's laughter shriveled into panic as they began choking too, their small hands clawing at invisible cords tightening inside their bodies. Chairs scraped. Silver clattered. A porcelain plate shattered against the floor. The dining room, once a portrait of elegance, erupted into chaos. Servants rushed forward, unsure whether to help or to run. The master collapsed sideways, knocking over his untouched breakfast of buttered bread and figs. The mistress's shriek was cut short as she fell back, eyes wide, mouth frothing. Imagine standing in that room. The chandeliers still swayed. Gently, the aroma of mint and sugar still hung in the air. But every sound had turned into horror. The rattle of cutlery, the gurgling coughs, the thud of bodies hitting polished wood. You can almost hear the porcelain goblet rolling across, the floor spinning, before falling still. And at the far end of the table, half hidden in the shadow of the great drapes, stood Clara. Her face betrayed nothing, not fear, not triumph, only silence. In her hands, she still clutched the teapot, empty now, its poison, already swallowed by those who had feasted for so long on her suffering. The family gasped and clawed at their throats, their cries echoing off gilded walls. Clara did not move. Her eyes locked on the master, his power unraveling before her very eyes. The chaos built, but Clara remained still, like a figure carved from stone. But who was Clara? What could drive a young enslaved woman, trapped in the heart of Charleston's wealth and cruelty, to pour death into her master's morning tea? This was not madness. It was not chance. It was the beginning of something far darker. And to understand why Clara chose poison over silence, we must step back into the world that made her. In Charleston, the mansion stood like a monument to power. Its walls of white stucco gleamed in the summer sun, and its windows reflected the harbor waters where ships carried rice, indigo, and cotton to the world. To outsiders, it was a vision of elegance, a place where fortunes were made and families flourished. Inside, the wealth was impossible to ignore. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across mahogany floors waxed to perfection. French wallpaper lined the halls, its floral patterns imported at a cost that could have purchased a dozen lives. The dining table stretched long, draped in imported linen, each place setting arranged with silver forks and English porcelain. At breakfast, the air smelled of warm bread, sugared peaches, and fragrant tea steeped in fine china. Every detail was designed to remind anyone who entered. This was power. This was permanence. But just outside those walls, another world pressed, close. A world the masters preferred to forget until they needed it. Clara's world. Her cabin sagged in the humidity, its wooden planks warped, its roof patched with straw that leaked during the summer rains. The floor was bare dirt, damp from the marshy ground. Smoke from a small fire stung the eyes, filling the cramped space where a single cot, a chipped bowl, and a thin blanket were all she could claim as her own. Rats darted along the beams there, scratching a lullaby to sleepless nights. The same morning the master sipped sugared tea, Clara had swallowed nothing but bitterness. Her stomach cramped with hunger, her lips dry. But still she rose to fetch and carry, to polish the forks she could never use, to pour the drinks she would never taste. Imagine watching this unfold with your own eyes. A family feasting on candied fruit while only steps away, Men and women crouched on dirt floors, their ribs visible beneath worn skin. The air was thick with perfume in one room, and with the stench of sweat and sickness in the other. One house, two worlds, and a chasm between them so cruel it seemed carved by the devil himself. The masters spoke of refinement, of gentility, of honor. They dressed in silks and spoke French phrases to impress their guests. But what is refinement? When it is built on hunger. What is honor when it is paid for with chains? The contrast was unbearable. Children of the house ran barefoot across polished floors, laughter echoing under crystal chandeliers, while outside, Clara's younger brother staggered under a sack of rice so heavy it bent his back before he had grown into a man. Inside, the master's wife powdered her face, hiding the lines of age. Outside, Clara's mother's skin cracked under the lash, her body aging decades in a handful of years. The mansion consumed and the cabins endured. Yet cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was in the silence, in the refusal to see, in the fact that a family could eat until their stomachs ached, then throw scraps to dogs while children in the cabins starved quietly. Clara moved between these worlds every day. She carried trays of sugared pastries past windows that looked down on the fields where men collapsed from heatstroke. She polished goblets with hands cracked from scrubbing laundry and scalding water. She breathed in the scent of cinnamon and cloves while her own meals tasted of corn mush and desperation. The contrast was a wound that deepened each time she crossed that threshold. And imagine this. What happens when a wound festers too long? When hunger, humiliation, and cruelty pile higher than the silver trays on the master's table? Because beneath the polished silver and polished lies, something darker stirred. Clara felt it each time she bowed her head, each time she bit her tongue, each time she poured the tea she herself was forbidden to taste. But in the silence of her suffering, Clara was learning, watching, waiting, and soon her silence would become deadly. Clara was only 15 when she was sold. The auction block in Charleston was a theater of cruelty. Men prodded at teeth, women forced to turn and show their backs, children ripped from their mother's arms. On that humid summer day, Clara's mother clutched her hand until the whip cracked and forced them apart. She remembered her mother's scream. She remembered her own silence, choked back so the buyers would not see weakness. Her first master had promised her light work. "A girl like you belongs in the house, not the field," he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. But the house was not safety. It was a prison with polished walls. She scrubbed floors until her knees bled. She served wine she would never taste. And at night, when the halls grew quiet, she endured the master's gaze lingering too long, the sound of his footsteps in places they did not belong. His wife noticed, of course, wives always noticed. And in her jealousy, cruelty sharpened. Clara's work doubled, her punishments harsher, her meals smaller. Every bruise was another secret, every insult another scar. But Clara endured. She learned to move silently, to observe, to understand the rhythms of the house better than anyone. She carried trays with her eyes lowered, but her mind was awake, watching, remembering. There was a time she still clung to hope. The master dangled it before her like a coin before a beggar. He promised freedom if she proved herself loyal. He swore she would one day have her papers, her chance at life beyond the mansion gates. For years, Clara bent under that promise, working harder, enduring humiliation, believing there might be light at the end of endless night. And then, one winter evening, she overheard him laughing. He told his guests she was no different than a mule, that freedom was never hers to claim. He laughed as though her hope had been a joke shared among them. That night, something inside Clara broke. She had given everything, her body, her silence, her obedience, and been repaid with betrayal. The promise of freedom had been nothing but another chain, invisible but no less heavy. And as if betrayal weren't enough, her younger brother's fate sealed her resolve. Sent to the fields as a boy, he labored until his hands blistered and bled. One sweltering summer day, he faltered beneath the sun, collapsing by the water trough. The overseer's whip came down with fury, striking again and again until he lay still. Clara found him hours later, his body limp, his breath shallow. He survived, but never truly recovered. His back bore scars so deep they seemed carved into his very bones. That was the moment Clara stopped praying for freedom. She began to dream of vengeance. Imagine being in her place, every door locked, every choice stolen, every path leading only back to chains. Would you bow lower? Or would you begin to wonder, what would it feel like to strike back even if it cost everything? Clara was no longer the girl who bent her head. She was a woman who carried within her a fire that could no longer be smothered. She began to study. She remembered the herbs her mother once used for healing. Leaves that soothed fevers, roots that cured pain, and others whispered about in fear that killed quietly. Clara's silence was not weakness anymore. It was preparation. She learned the rhythms of the household, the times meals were served, the cups that were filled, the hands that reached, without suspicion. She knew her master's habits, the tea he demanded every morning, sweetened just so, served in the same porcelain cup. And in her silence, a plan was born. But this was only the beginning. For while others sang hymns of salvation, Clara was preparing the hymn of death, and the first note would be poured with the morning tea. The night before it happened, Charleston was alive with music. The master's family entertained guests in the parlor, their voices raised in laughter, the sharp notes of a piano filling the air. The clink of glasses, the shuffle of silk gowns, the sweet smoke of cigars, it all blended into a celebration of wealth. But in the kitchen, Clara stood alone. Her hands moved with steady precision, though her heart hammered like a drum. On the wooden table before her lay a small pouch of herbs, ground into a fine powder, bitter in smell, sharp to the nose. It was nothing like the fragrant mint that usually flavored the master's tea. She poured the powder into a clay bowl, mixing it with a trickle of water until it clumped together, black and tar-like. The candlelight flickered across her face, revealing neither hesitation nor triumph, only a cold determination. Imagine it. Imagine holding death in your hands. Not a knife, not a gun, but something smaller, quieter. A powder so unassuming it could vanish in a single sip, yet powerful enough to tear through flesh and blood. Would your hands tremble? Would you falter? Or would you steady yourself as Clara did, and whisper a prayer that the poison would do what your voice never could? Outside, the mansion buzzed with life. Inside the cabins, silence stretched long and heavy. The enslaved had heard rumors. Something was stirring. Clara had spoken little, but her eyes told a story of resolve. Rachel, another house servant, had asked quietly, "What are you planning?" Clara only shook her head. Some things were too dangerous to say aloud. In the quiet hours, Clara prepared everything. She scrubbed the teapot until it gleamed, making sure no trace of powder lingered on its rim. She laid out the porcelain cups, polished to perfection, each one belonging to the very people who had stripped her of freedom. The irony burned like fire in her chest. The mansion's bells tolled midnight. Guests began to depart, their carriages rattling down cobbled streets. The laughter faded, doors closed, candles snuffed out. One by one, the household fell into silence. Clara lay awake in her cot, eyes fixed on the rafters above. Sleep never came. Each sound outside, the hoot of an owl, the crack of branches in the night breeze, felt like an omen. She thought of her mother's scream on the auction block. She thought of her brother's scarred back. She thought of the promise of freedom, dangled and broken like glass. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, they will drink. Tomorrow, I will speak with silence. Hours dragged like chains. The sky began to pale with the first hints of dawn. Clara rose before the bell, her movements slow, deliberate. She tied her apron. She washed her hands again and again, though they were already raw from scrubbing. She reached for the pouch, the powder that held everything, her rage, her grief, her vengeance. The fire was lit. The water boiled. The mint leaves steeped. And into the pot, she poured the dark mixture, watching it dissolve into something sweet and deadly. The steam curled upward, carrying with it the scent of sugar, the fragrance of mint, and beneath it, hidden, the bitter soul of vengeance. What would you do, standing there with the steam rising in your face, knowing the next pour would change history? Would you hesitate at the edge of the abyss? Or would you step forward as Clara did and let the poison flow? And when dawn broke, the porcelain cups were set, the tea was poured, and the family drank deeply. The morning sun crept over Charleston, spilling golden light across the mansion's white walls. Inside, the house stirred awake. Servants moved swiftly, polishing, sweeping, preparing the dining room for the master's breakfast. The porcelain cups gleamed in their places, lined like soldiers on the table. Clara entered quietly, the teapot warm in her hands. Steam rose in gentle curls, fragrant with mint sweetened with sugar. To any eye, it was the same tea as every morning. To Clara, it was something else entirely, a vessel of vengeance. The master sat at the head of the table, his face still flushed from the previous night's indulgence. His wife adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes sharp with suspicion as always. Their children laughed, jostling each other for pastries. The dining room, with its golden drapes and polished silver, shimmered with wealth and power. Clara stepped forward. She poured slowly, steadily. The liquid streamed into the porcelain cups, innocent and deadly. She bowed her head, as she always did, then stepped back into the shadows. The family lifted their cups. The master drank first, swallowing greedily. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, muttering something about the day's work. Then he paused. A cough rattled his chest. He reached for his throat. His face twisted. His wife scolded him at first, then lifted her own cup. Within moments, her lips parted in a scream. She dropped the china, tea spilling across the white linen. The children gasped, then choked, their small hands clawing at their necks. Their laughter turned to shrieks, then to gurgling silence. The dining room descended into chaos. Silverware clattered to the floor, chairs toppled. A porcelain plate shattered into jagged pieces. The chandeliers swayed above as if the room itself recoiled. The scent of mint and sugar lingered in the air, now tainted by vomit and sweat. Imagine being there. The polished table suddenly stained, the sound of coughs and gagging louder than hymns. You can almost hear the teacup rolling across the floor, spinning until it clinks softly against the wall. The master fell sideways, his hand knocking over a bowl of figs. His wife collapsed back into her chair, her pearls snapping loose, scattering across the floor like fallen teeth. One of the children convulsed, his eyes rolling back, his fists pounding weakly against the wood. Servants froze at the doorway, horror painted across their faces. Some rushed forward instinctively, others backed away, terrified to be near the family as they writhed. And Clara? She stood still, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Her heart pounded, but her body did not move. She watched as power unraveled before her eyes, as the masters who had commanded her life crumbled in their own house. The cries of dominance, the whips, the commands, the insults, were gone, replaced by gasps, screams, and silence. The minutes stretched endlessly. The coughing grew weaker. The writhing slowed. At last, the dining room fell still, the only sound the faint drip of tea from a shattered cup onto the polished floor. Clara exhaled once, slowly. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of silence shift. But imagine her thoughts in that moment. Did she feel triumph? Did she feel sorrow? Or only the terrifying calm of a woman who had crossed the line and could never return? The family lay scattered across their feast, their faces frozen in pain, their bodies twisted in grotesque tableau. The room that had once been a stage for wealth now looked like a battlefield, and Clara, half hidden in shadow, remained untouched. And in that silence, Clara knew. The house would never forgive, Charleston would never forget. The poison had worked, but at what cost? The mansion was never the same after that morning. The master's body lay sprawled across the dining table, his mouth still twisted in agony. His wife's pearls remained scattered across the floor, glinting faintly like drops of milk among the stains of tea. The children, once symbols of innocence to outsiders, lay motionless, their laughter silenced forever. By midday, Charleston knew. News traveled faster than ships in the harbor. A prominent family struck down suddenly, violently, during their morning meal. Doctors were summoned, whispering of fevers, of spoiled leaves, of God's mysterious judgment. But in the kitchens and the cabins, the whispers took on a sharper edge. Everyone knew it was no accident. All eyes turned to Clara. She was seized, before nightfall, dragged from her cabin, wrists bound tight with coarse rope, interrogated, accused, beaten until her body bore new scars to match the old. Some say she confessed nothing, holding her silence like a weapon. Others claim she admitted her act with a steady voice, saying only, "He promised me freedom. I gave him death." History leaves us no single truth of her words, but the silence that followed says enough. Clara's punishment was inevitable. In Charleston, rebellion was never left unanswered. Some claimed she was hanged by dawn. Others whispered she was burned, her ashes scattered without a marker. Still others swore she was dragged through the streets as a warning to all who might dare to follow. But the family she struck did not recover. Their wealth crumbled. Their mansion grew quiet. Guests no longer visited. Servants spoke of a curse. Even the harbor seemed to turn colder, the tides less generous. It was as if Clara's act had not only poisoned the tea, but the very legacy of the house. Imagine the silence after. No laughter in the parlor, no clink of goblets, only hushed prayers and the echo of chains. You can almost feel the weight of the fear pressing down on everyone who remained, slaves and masters alike. For the enslaved, Clara's story became more than tragedy. It became a whisper of possibility, a warning to masters who believed themselves untouchable. A spark that glowed in the dark corners of cabins, carried from mouth to mouth, generation to generation. The masters tried to erase her, to bury her memory with her body. But legends do not die so easily. Her silence, her act, lingered. Haunting. Charleston's streets carried in the secret songs of those who dreamed of freedom. And so Clara of Charleston became more than a name. She became a symbol. A reminder that even the smallest act of defiance could bring a house of power crashing down. But ask yourself, what would you have done if you were Clara? If promises had been broken, if your family had been torn from you, if every prayer ended in silence, would you have bowed lower? Or would you have lifted the cup, knowing it carried both vengeance and death? The tea cooled. The family was buried. But the taste of vengeance lingered, and in Charleston they never forgot the name Clara. Stories like this must never be forgotten. If you want to uncover more untold truths, tales buried in the shadows of history, stay with us. Because the next story is even darker.